Reminder to everyone, we have a presentation, our second listening session. We're back from recess. It is 7:59 p.m. Mr. Paul Lott with the National Society for the Advancement of Black Americans. Mr. Lott, 20 minutes presentation, and then we'll follow that with any questions that the commissioners may have. Again, commissioners, try to hold your questions until we have question time, and the floor is yours, Mr. Lott.
That's good. I'm trying to move through some of these slides. I'm going to move through fairly quickly. We can skip that part because we're going to end up going through it. So, in the midst of the the protests over the deaths of various Black individuals and the riots of last summer, a group of us got together, some of us former Harvard alumni, et cetera, and formed the NSABA to say, rather than just relying on protest, let's look at data, and from the data, try to make changes in the different areas. Just like the unemployment rate is different no matter where you are in the country, issues that cause what we call Black poverty clusters are different from region to region, okay? Poverty varies from region to region, and poverty varies among different groups. So that's pretty much it. Right now, we have about 10,000 members in the organization itself. That's nationwide. We have reached to about 120,000 people of all colors, et cetera, et cetera. We have been putting out and offering supplemental programs primarily in Pennsylvania and Maryland. We're going to start next summer here in Virginia. And some of the programs are all of the programs are specifically targeted towards underperforming students. But we'll get back to that. So the issue that I'd like to talk about today with regards to kind of the reason why I'm here has to do with the data related to disparities in education, okay? Just to give you my background, this is a subject that's near and dear to me. Before I was 13 years old, I actually went to 13 different elementary schools. My father was a civil rights minister whose primary responsibility was taking bad churches in the Midwest and the South and working with them to reform them, bring them up to date from all different kinds of situations. I have seen my family has been homeless when I was a child due to various factors, none our own. My father was abducted and held for 30 days and beaten because of his beliefs. I myself, at 6 years old, a group of kids befriended me and said, there's a shortcut through the white projects. And then they proceeded to try to murder me by beating me with cinder blocks and breaking my left arm. An event that did not prompt the police being called. My dad fixed at the kitchen table. I forgot all about it until I was going to the military. And they told me I was lying on my medical report. And I said, what do you mean? They said, you broke your arm. And then it dawned on me, I was 6 years old. It never occurred to me to even bring it up. And that's what the times were. I have a scar on my left shoulder blade where I was jumped and knifed and left for dead. So I know what racial discrimination looks like. I know what it means to go to bad schools. Norwood Elementary School in Birmingham, Alabama, is a school that was decertified. This was a school that I went to, and I told my dad that I don't think that they're trying to teach me anything because I intentionally got 8 out of 10 problems on a test wrong to test my teacher, and she still gave me an A. She was grading on behavior. So I just put that out there to let you know. Every 7th year, I've taken a sabbatical, and I've worked in some of the worst school systems in the country. I've worked in Gary, Indiana, Roxbury, Mattapan, South Chicago, et cetera, all with the goal of trying to work with underperforming Black students and trying to figure out what it is that can help them. Why were they underperforming, right? I'm a kid that came from a poor neighborhood, a poor situation. My mom only had an 8th grade education, but I ended up at Harvard. And so from my perspective, I wanted to understand and reach back and try to figure out how things went. So the thing that troubles me that's going on today is one of the major messages that's being given to children is that there is this systemic racism in American society that is holding them back. And what bothers me is this is the primary message that the gangs use in all of the places that I've been to get young black men not to focus in school. Because the story is that since the system is against you, why try? So many of the things that I hear in terms of equity education, et cetera, these things are not new. I got Black history education at Norwood, in Norwood. I had it in the South, and every Southern school I went to had it. We learned about the Civil Rights Movement, we learned about slavery, we watched all the videos. And yet, in the situation that I was in, it did not increase anyone's academic performance. It increased people's anger at the system. Things that we try don't always have the effects that we think that should be. So let's look at the numbers. Let's answer the questions. And I'm not saying these to say that we should not have some cultural sensitivity in our training. I think that a certain level of cultural sensitivity in academics and education is simply truth. That we're presenting a non-cleansed history to the kids that show both sides of the story. And I believe that firmly. However, I don't believe that there should be an underpinning that American society is somehow working against these kids. And I'm going to look at it at two levels, actually three levels. National, Virginia overall in terms of academics, and then I pulled all the numbers for Prince William County from 2008 until current. So, U.S. Census, 1959. I'm going to try to keep up with this so we started tracking poverty rates in 1959, and I assert that the purpose of education is to deliver children who are able to become adults who are financially independent and educated enough to participate in American society without having to deal with the burden of poverty, okay? So in 1959, they started to track poverty by race, okay? And we know from history that the economic starting point of Black Americans was 100%, mostly. And I can go through the numbers, right? Roughly 3% of Americans were not poor at the end of the Civil War, but if you go to the total numbers, it's about 97%. When you look at the total GDP, or rather the net worth, and you average it all out, it's pretty much 100%, but I'll say 97%. We know that in the South, at the end of the Civil War, 90% of blacks lived in the South. We also know that the literacy rate in 1865, or the average Black American, that the literacy rate was below kindergarten level in 1865, that by 1968, or by the 1950s, the average education level, formal education level, was about the 6th grade, okay? So these poverty figures show from a national perspective. Blacks at 55% in 1968, drops about 20.7%. And by 1968, so that's like a 20-point drop in 9 years. And then from 1968 to 2018, a 50-year period, you had another drop, down to about another 14%. Okay? White poverty was 18.8% in 1959, fell to 10% in 1968. This is 8.1, but they've adjusted the number. White poverty was 10.1 in 2018. They adjusted those numbers downward this year. So for 50 years, white poverty remained the same, which means that if you are a black person born in the United States, you're more likely to escape poverty than a white child. Because white poverty is flat. But black poverty from 1959 until 2018 has shown a 3.5 times progress over white Americans. You cannot say that this country is systemically racist. What you can say is that this country, despite all of its flaws and faults, has been correcting the evils of slavery and Jim Crow. Because in 100 years, we went from 100% poverty to 60% out of poverty, right? So that 34.7%, that means that the rest of those people were no longer poor. Now, in the last 2 years, or 2018, 2019, the poverty rates fell in both racial groups by 5.2%, exactly the same. This, to me, does not show numbers of a racist America. This shows numbers of an America that's working it out. So, if we follow the logic, if whites have privilege and the whites have advantage, and that advantage is created by a system to give them that advantage, if the numbers tell us that the ultimate measure, your ability to leave school and get a job and take care of yourself, is advantaging Black Americans over white Americans, we cannot assert there is white privilege, and we cannot assert systemic racism. And I dug through these numbers because I was challenged in a subcommittee meeting, and I doubled down and rechecked my numbers. These are raw numbers from the census. So this graph is actually from the Census Bureau website that shows that every racial group has shown improvement over the last 60 years, except white Americans have been limited. It's been restricted. For 50 years, it was about 10% and didn't move anywhere. It moved up and down around 10%, but it stayed there. It's had a recent drop, along with Asians, who have finally, for the first time in history, matched the white poverty rate at 7.3%. Okay? But everyone else has come down. Blacks, another 2%. Latinos, another 3% or so. Okay? So that's the piece. We're looking at a national level. Where do we stand? What's going on there? So let's flip down and let's look at, we're going to go through the state level. These are statistics from Virginia. These are from the VOE site. Didn't make them up. These are, you can go on the site and you can pull them over yourself. Of the 100, there are 118 school districts that have Black students. So not all of them have Black students. Okay? Of 118 students, 94 of those have Blacks graduate over 90%, at 90%. So 80%, they graduate 90%. 47 of those schools, and 47 of those schools, or 40% of schools in Virginia, Blacks graduate at a higher rate than whites. In 77 school districts, the white-Black graduation gap is 5% or less. So the gaps are pretty close. It's pretty close for more than half of them. There are 8 Virginia schools with a double-digit graduation rate difference. And in 4 of those 8, Blacks graduate at a double-digit rate above whites. So it's not perfect, it's not parity, but I would count that as progress, okay? Of the 5 largest school districts in Virginia, the graduation rates, only Virginia Beach has a graduation rate above 3%, and this is the gap, the difference between Black and white, okay? Now, there are 2 different graduates you can look at. You can look at the graduation rate, you can look at the completion rate. The graduation rate is just 4 year on time. Completion rate includes like GEDs and other completion rates. So Virginia Beach, in Virginia right now is tracking to show the greatest amount of progress in terms of closing the gap. But Prince Williams, 2.3%, Loudoun, 2%, and these are 2018 figures from their websites, okay? Fairfax, 2.7%. Chesterfield County, 2.1%. By definition, this cannot be called a disparity, because a disparity must be obvious and significant. This is insignificant. This actually falls within the areas of what we call statistical variation. Was its disparity is defined as noticeable and usually significant difference or dissimilarity. So we can't technically call these graduation. Now, we've also done studies, and the NSBA, we started studies looking at data across all 50 states, and we were surprised by the data that we saw. And what we found was this: in every major city except for Washington, D.C., where Blacks do poorly, whites do worse by at least half a percentage point or more. DC was the only city that had a huge disparity between Black and whites. And when we looked at the zip codes of the performance, it's because of how segregated DC is. You go to Anacostia, you have Blacks in one area, you have wealthier whites and the politicians of the other area, you have 34, 35% disparity. But in Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, Baltimore, whites and blacks, where schools were bad, they both did poorly. Example, Baltimore. Blacks were graduating at 73% when whites were graduating at 72%. Okay? Similar in Philadelphia, similar in Pittsburgh. We went through the numbers, we covered those numbers, and we tried to push those out. About 5 minutes, so I'm going to run, okay? What's not on this version of it, because I don't see it here, is we also pulled out the numbers for Prince William County. And Prince William County, well, let me do this. The numbers in Prince William, just to let you know, is Prince William in 2018, the black graduation rate was 82%, or 82.5%. White was about 88%. And without you being able to see the numbers, and I have shared a version of this, from 2008 until 2021. Now, we adjust out for 2020 and 2021 because there's the COVID impact. But if we look at that entire path, the black graduation rate improved by 11.62%. The white graduation rate improved by 9.2%, which means that the black graduation rate improved over whites at a rate of 2.4%. Prince William County is doing something right in correcting inequities. And it's been a trend that's been going on since before. I'm sure before 2008, but these numbers are from VOE, and these are the numbers that the VOE provides. When we go, those are graduation rates, completion rates. Same thing, we see 10.5% for blacks improvement. We see 6.3% for whites, 4.12% advantage to black students in overall improvement of performance. And the dropout rate, in some dropout rates, for example, you had some odd years, but in 2050, the dropout rate for blacks and whites was in less than 0.5% difference. In those other years, you started out where the difference was at 4%. Right now, it looks like it's about 2%, but you've had years where it's been below 2%. About 4 years where Prince William's had a differential below 2%. So what's the point of all of this? The point of all of this is that Prince William County has successfully, through focusing on academic rigor and not anything really cultural or racial, and improving the outcomes for kids, the ultimate outcome. And the ultimate outcome is being able to take care of themselves after graduation. And so what I'm asking is, when we go forward and we look at culturally sensitive teaching in the classroom, et cetera, we consider the amount of time. How much time does it take away from the actual academic subject? Does learning an enhanced level of cultural sensitivity help them after graduation? I'm going to tell you no. Statistically, you remember about 15% of what you learn in school. You're going to 15%, the rest you're not going to learn, but you will use your academic skills on an ongoing basis. Okay? Academic rigor tends to produce better results than other methods. And academic rigor applied across black, white, Asian, no matter what it is, produces better academic results. And I am just here to say, be cautious. You're going to go forward and you're going to give recommendations about what it means, what you can do, what the school district can do to affect outcomes. The job here is not to make people feel better about themselves. If that doesn't lead to a better outcome, that's a parent's job. I will tell you, my parents, I learned history from my parents. My father made sure that we sat down and we watched this movie or this documentary or that documentary. It wasn't the burden of the school to do that. It's the burden of the parent to do that. And when the parent doesn't do something, it does not then become the burden of the school to do it. Your school system is one of the best in the country. And you've been eliminating the gap over decades without any of this. That's something to be celebrated. That's something to say, let's look at what's been working and not shift directions, but do more of that. What I do see is this. In the school systems where we have looked at statistical margins as fine as what you people have put in place, the difference in that 95 to 100 or 95 to 99% improvement had to do primarily with the introduction of individualized learning selectively for children who had reached the ceiling, right? It's exceptions management. If 95% of your kids perform well in the system that it is, it's a lot easier and a lot less expensive to focus on individualized learning for that 8 to 5% that can go to the next level. But you're doing extremely well. And that's really what I came here to say. In terms of, I appreciated the previous speaker in terms of cultural sensitivity, but there's so many things that I disagreed with. He didn't define justice. To me, justice is being able to get a job and take care of you and your family and create financial stability for your community. And that's something I can measure. It's not something I feel, it's something that I can measure. And that's where we have to get to. What can you measure? If you can't measure it, you should not be teaching it. And I'll end with this. In the words of Solomon, there is nothing new under the sun. In Alabama, they doubled down and focused on Black history as a way to change things, and it didn't do anything. In Mississippi, my mother was born on the same plantation that my family were slaves on. She left when she was 17, only to find out that the woman who ran the plantation was her great aunt, and it was kept from the young Black kids so they wouldn't spread it around town and there would be no backlash. I spent many a summer on that farm. My grandfather was what they say puckwooder. It's a pulpwooder, but puckwooder. If you did messed up in my family, you spent the summers cutting down trees with my grandfather. And there was a lot of racism there. But I encourage you to distinguish between racism and racial discrimination. You cannot change how people feel about each other. And I'll give you examples of massive failures in the public school system. The metric system. We still talk in feet and inches. Bilingual education. The biggest joke they always said when I went to Europe was, what do you call someone that spoke 2 languages? Bilingual. What do you call someone who spoke 1 language? American. Certain things just don't catch on the way we want them to catch on. We tried these initiatives before. They don't work. And the reason why is that most people are too lazy or not that focused on it. When they go out and they get into real life, 2 languages aren't useful in real life, so that's why we didn't do it. In real life, feet and inches is what we use. That's why it never caught on. Our road signs weren't changed where we needed to do it. It's just not going to catch on. And if we then teach our children that their performance in school needs to be dependent on how much they feel their teachers identify with them, they will be miserable failures in life because no boss will ever do that for them again. So part of what we have to teach is be confident in yourself. You don't need others to create confidence for you. And that you can be responsible for educating yourself. Look at history. What, the first 15 founding presidents didn't go to graduate from high school? Which means that education is a process that exists outside of school. Why don't we teach them that? Why don't we teach them that teach them to be rigorous readers, fierce self-learners, so that they can get the education. They can pick up Black poetry. They can read books. I never learned about Frederick Douglass and what he did in school. I read a book. I picked up a book because that is what was significant to me. And that's what came from my parents. When the hand of government tries to make these kinds of changes, you create backlash. Because whether you think you are or not, you are selectively addressing one group over another. Whether you think you are or not, children will see it as focusing on someone else over them. In the NSABA, in the last year, in our Maryland chapter, I have 3 parents whose white sons committed suicide. Because of this emphasis, this focus, this demonization. And I think that, so that's why I'm leaving it. We have to be careful. We have to think about it. We have to look at the data. You're doing well, keep doing well. And don't throw something in to muddy the system. You can look at honesty in history, right? I'll tell you right now, I can tell you for a fact that most history is written at like a 5th grade level. I don't know who wrote these books, but Mary Meyer, who's a professor at MIT, and I studied under her at Harvard, went through, she publishes a group of wonderful books. She recently died, where she actually looked at the ratification of the Constitution.
I'm so sorry, Mr. Lott.
And I'm going,
We'll have time, sorry. We went to 25 minutes for the presentation, but we do have questions, so the
Sure.
conversation will continue. I'm sure there are questions on, everyone's minds, perhaps,
Go for it.
or not. But just a reminder to everyone to let's try to do this round robin so that everyone has a chance to ask their questions if they have them. And we will let's keep it to 2 questions per person, and limit our time to be mindful of everyone else. And let's go ahead and get started with questions if we have any. Commissioner Haddow.
Mr. Lott, thank you for your presentation, and I was delighted to have heard a version of it in our Education Committee meeting. Is it your sense that in Prince William County that we have such a pervasive systemic racism issue in the schools that this culturally responsible teaching is a critical element that has to be overlaid on top of it in order to correct that systemic racism?
not going to get into the data here, but what the primary issue that faces the Black community and Latino community is not that we have a system that currently is discriminatory, but we didn't start from the same place as others did. So, and we have some built-in challenges that are really hard to deal with. And I'll give you an example of one. A first-generation college graduate makes less money than a second or third-generation college graduate. And that's because that first generation doesn't know how to work in the system. It's kind of like you have a superhighway that works just fine, but the on-ramps are inconsistent. And I think it's the on-ramps that are our problem. That's just one example. The other example is parenting, early child, pre-K, universal pre-K. We thought it was going to solve everything. But NIH published a study saying that the effects of pre-K wear off by the third grade. Okay, but we have other studies that show that rigor, either training the parents on what to do in early childhood development, actually had a longer, better effect in the long-term academic outcomes, and that reading rigor corrected for some of these differences. Right, Black Americans and Latino Americans suffer from historically low vocabulary and stimulus in early childhood development. And it affects how we perform long-term. People, we used to believe that you learn new brain connections as you learn things. It turns out that's not true. You're born with too many, and you're pruning as you're going through the education process. And the less rigorous the education process, the more brain connections your brain throws away. So middle class, upper middle class people living in a highly stimulated environment, they're retaining more connections and giving them a significant advantage over those who didn't come from that. And it greatly affects poor Black and poor Latinos, even when they move into school systems that are better.
Thank you. School Board Member Williams.
Thank you, Vice Chair Akbar. Not sure really where to begin. I'm curious, maybe you could help me understand a little bit about what it is that you're saying and the purpose of your organization, and how it relates to what we're doing here on the commission. I'm a little confused by your presentation, and I'm wondering if you can help educate me further. I understand that your organization is the National Society for the Advancement of Black Americans, and you talk about in your presentation, you talk about systemic racism and white privilege, but then you say that the problems are not because of systemic racism, it doesn't exist, and that there really isn't white privilege, and that I'm gathering what you're talking about has to do with poverty instead, but I'm confused based on your language and what you're saying versus your presentation. Could you provide some more clarity on where you were going with this, and also where you got your statistic that said, or your data point number 2 that said, we know from history the economic starting point of Black Americans was 100% poverty. I know you clarified, you said maybe 3% or so, maybe 97%, but I'm curious how that factors in, because there were Black Americans that did not start in poverty. It wasn't just 3%. And I'm just confused. Maybe you can help tie it together so it makes a little bit more sense here, if we're here for Black Americans or poverty.
What exists, if you look at a poverty map of the United States, where poverty clusters exist, at the epicenter of most large poverty clusters, you'll find Black Americans. It's just the truth. You have exceptions, such as Appalachia, et cetera, where it affects whites as well. But when we talk about urban centers, it primarily affects Blacks and Hispanics, okay? Our organization, when we first started out, we were looking at the root causes of issues. People that can make a living and take care of themselves aren't angry and don't feel the need to riot, okay? They don't feel the need to do what happened in West Baltimore, 2015, torn down, half the stores never opened up again, okay? So there's no inconsistency in it. We focused on Black poverty clusters, and it leads us in certain directions in terms of education, economics, and causes. Causes are important because we can't solve a problem until we can quantify it. And that is just the truth. We can talk about it all we want to. Now, I can't say I understand completely what your question is. My purpose here is to present the data here. My purpose here is not to promote my organization in any way whatsoever. My purpose here is to say, this is data that we looked at. When we looked at the data, initially, I thought that I was going to see greater levels of disparity, that I was going to see a different result. And we were surprised, particularly with the Virginia school numbers, that they weren't what we thought they were going to be. When we went through and did the 50 state reports, they were not what we thought they were going to be. People were mixing in, they'll say slavery had an impact, and then they'll expand it to talk about people of color, when the issues that Hispanics face is completely different than the issues that Blacks faced. And we can't say this was caused by slavery or past discrimination against Blacks and then throw Hispanics into the mix to make the numbers worse. Like Baltimore, 54% of Hispanics, that's a graduation rate, even though Blacks are at the top. But if you look on newspaper articles, they'll average it out, say people of color, it looks really bad. And so that's that. I don't know what explanation you're looking for, but our goal and what we focus on in terms of the programs we deliver them in Black poverty clusters that include people of all ethnic groups, Because it turns out when you, and is that those clusters have historical links to segregated areas, either primary or secondary target areas of the Great Migration, which means that there was a historical cause to that starting point. People like to forget that if the poverty rate in the black community is 20%, 80% of the blacks aren't poor. But we spend all of our time talking about the 20%. Now, what we do is we actually try to help the 20%. Where are they? What's their zip code? What's the education? What are the education issues? We look at why students underperform, why young black males in particular have an accelerated rate of underperformance when they're about 12, 13 years old. So it'll take a lot more time than this to go through what our mission is and what we do. What I hope that comes out today is let's not blame everything on race. In other words, let's not blame everything to say that today there's a racial issue. That's not to say that there was not a racial cause to kick it off. And that if we say these laws, the systemic racism was addressed in the 60s, let's look at today and say, okay, I have these black children from these black parents who came from that disadvantage. What can I do to catch them up? Is that reading rigor? Is that additional time after school? How do we diagnose it? How do we quantify it? Not all black kids can be put into the same category. When I was at Harvard, the Harvard Black Student Society, we used to sit, the first meeting we sat back, and the kids that never experienced any poverty were the most loud of all. And me and a couple of my friends that were from Detroit and different places, we sat back and would just giggle because this was sons of lawyers and doctors that went on about things that they had no experience about. And that's the danger. I don't know, I guess I'm saying I can't answer the question that you're asking. I don't think that it's relevant to this. And I think it's part of a larger conversation as to what we're trying to do in our mission. And I don't think that our mission, what we do across the country, has very little to do with this. I want to keep this as saying, it doesn't take away from that. It doesn't take away from, so the only sources you need to worry about is my numbers are from the US Census and from the Virginia Department of Education. Public sources, you can Google any of this and it'll pop up.
Okay, so I have trouble understanding how you arrive at the fact that systemic racism and white privilege don't exist, but yet the group of individuals you speak of who are most impacted in today's education, as you say, are people of color.
It's not what I said.
Oh, okay.
I said there are impacts to people, to blacks from one historical situation. There are impacts to Hispanics that's different, and that it is a smaller percentage of the pie. Most blacks are doing just fine.
Okay.
However, systemic poverty, what we work with is, and it's not here in Princeton, systemic poverty is an issue that needs to be highlighted because the systems that create systemic poverty affects all races, including whites. In fact, whites in greater numbers. If you look at 50 years where whites have been locked in 10% poverty, this is not my number, it's just a fact. It's a fact. It means that a black kid born today has a greater opportunity to escape poverty than a white kid born today. That is a fact. It's a fact, supported by 60 years of census data. And that's not going to change.
Commissioner Williams,
Okay.
Schoolmember Williams,
I just wanted to
we
kind
could
of
give it a
finish
two
my
questions.
question. I didn't even really, he kind of cut me off and I didn't really get a
We
chance
could do it
to
another round if we could have,
ask my
to
question.
finish your question.
Sure, I'm still confused, but we'll skip that part. Because how does all of this relate to what we're doing here in Prince William County and Prince William County Schools? Because Prince William County Schools has been doing culturally relevant teaching and materials and recognizing the difference and looking at the gap and further breaking down the data, not just the straight graduation rate. I mean, we even had a presentation on this last night, and we have an equity scorecard that does speak to our gaps. This is the older version. It was just updated, new material released yet last night at our school board meeting. But I'm wondering how this impacts Prince William County and Prince William County schools when we do see that there are continued gaps, and have you looked at those gaps, not just at graduation rate, but gaps throughout the educational system in Prince William County students?
Yes, we have. And part of the answer you won't like. Part of the answer, I don't know. Part of the answer is educators tend to look at their noses too much and analyze details that aren't relevant to the eventual outcome. Okay? So I've looked at your studies. I mean, I looked at the differences between the different types of diplomas, the programs that people go in by race, yada, 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 yada. The biggest difference, which none of you emphasize, and no school district emphasizes, the only gap that really matters is the gap between proficiency rates in math and English versus graduation rates, because that's one that affects a person's life. All the other things are very subjective, and there's no data that says that it's race-based or otherwise. The problem with the disparity is not active. It is a snapshot in time. If I look at the disparity from 1959, it says it's huge. If I forget about that and look at the disparity in 1968, it says it's huge. And then I forget about that and I come to 2021, I look at a disparity, which is a fraction of what it was 10 years ago, but without context. Well, you know, we have to deal with that disparity. It's quite significant. No, it's falling on its own with what you're doing. You're addressing it, you're fixing the problem, you're addressing it. What will turn you backwards in time is to start introducing things that have no evidence that they improve anyone's outcomes. And in fact, there's evidence to show that it worsens outcome. Getting students to accept that the system is rigged against them has been proven in this country for the last 60 years to decrease academic outcomes among the poor, not increase. If that lesson would increase outcomes, we wouldn't have a problem. Every black community in the country would be straight A students and all graduating from college. Because where I grew up, the place I grew up, Alabama, Chicago, Mount Vernon, Illinois, Memphis, Tennessee, Grenada, Mississippi, we all thought that from day one. Knee high was always our assumption, and it didn't do any good.
Thank you.
Commissioner Akbar, I don't have a question. I just want to point out something.
If we could just wait until the next round. Commissioner Porter, thank you for hand motioning, because I have trouble looking at.
And thank you, Mr. Lott, for being here. And I appreciate your, background and your growing up. I have a hard time relating to it. My great-great-grandmother was free before the Civil War. She could read and write, and she taught blacks and whites in the Dumfries area how to read and write. Like Commissioner Williams, I'm having a tough time following this in the poverty and the graduation rate and so on. We know that there have been historic milestones that have been made that had given African Americans, particularly, opportunities in this country. And a lot of those milestones were made because of the Civil Rights Movement and the legislation that was passed. With the passage of a lot of that legislation, it opened up avenues and opportunities for African Americans in particular who did not have those opportunities in the past. So obviously you have an opportunity to have better job opportunities, greater income, and better in your education all the way. But one of the things I want to just kind of focus on, you're tying in the poverty rate with the graduation rate, and you talked about the graduation rates looking, very good, and that is impressive, the graduation rates that we see. But how do we know that those young people graduating are actually graduating with the skills and tools that they need to be successful in their careers and their life, and in essence aren't necessarily just pushed through the system. So they graduate and they're not, and not being pushed. That's a question.
Poverty rate, it's all data, right? You know that it's working when the poverty rate goes down. That's how you know. So the black poverty rate has fallen over 60 years. It fell 5.2% between 2018 and 2018 and 2019. That tells me that you've been doing your job. It's the only number that counts. It's the only number we can measure. It's the only number that affects these kids.
Yeah, no, I was just saying, those rates are high, and we're not really sure that young people actually, learning and not being pushed through, through the schools. I also just wanted to make a comment, and I agree that America is not a racist country, because I'm an American and I'm not a racist.
Amen.
But there is racism in America.
Sure.
And there's racism in various systems within America, whether you agree with it or not. And that's a comment and a statement.
Thank you very much. Commissioner Haddow?
So, Mr. Lott, thank you for being here and providing what I think is very good information and data-driven. Sometimes we cloak when we disagree with someone with the expression that we're confused.
Yep.
I wasn't confused. I disagreed in part, and I'll tell you when I disagree rather than saying I'm confused. I also think that that one of the missions of this commission clearly is to look for best practices.
Yep.
And it doesn't have to be from Prince William County, because we may not be getting it right. And so when we heard earlier from Mr. Parker, who was from North Carolina, I don't think anyone asked him what relevance he had to Prince William County. But I think it's important for us to learn best practices and perspectives. So from your perspective, you're a resident of Prince William County, aren't you?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, so you're one of the residents here, and that was one of my questions. The second question I'll have is, what's your view in terms of the application of the data that you have collected in terms of its application to Prince William County, and spinning off of what you just said in terms of the outcome-based, data-driven indication of success is based on the reduction in the poverty rate? Are there other indicators that you think might help us to determine whether we're succeeding or failing in the current education system, other than just the reduction in the poverty rate tied to graduation rates?
Okay, so I think that Virginia as a whole has, in my opinion, okay, so in 2007, the State Department, USAID, asked me to do an analysis of how to rebuild the school system in a war-torn society. They had sent over educators from America to Liberia, Sierra Leone, Ivory Coast, and they were failing at it. So as a systems engineer, I designed large systems. They said, take a look at this and do an analysis and come back with it. And that is what informs what I'm about to say. There is a misalignment between, the four legs that, from what we talked about when we were doing the reconstruction, was standard, lesson plan, curricula, and assessment. Okay? Four legs. And those needed to dovetail. Tell me what you want to learn, give me a schedule on how to learn it, give me the materials to teach it, and then give me a way to determine if I met the standard, right? Unfortunately, the way things are kind of done in Virginia, there's a misalignment, and that misalignment is reflected in the fact that you have students that do grade well in what the teacher's teaching them, but their standardized assessments don't reflect it, okay? So that doesn't mean that they're not learning something. It means that the lesson plan and curricula do not successfully teach the standard that you're assessing against, okay? And that's a long-term problem that has to be vetted. And that may mean, I've spoken to dozens and dozens of teachers who actually don't really understand the standards completely. They understand parts of them, that disagree with parts of it. And that impacts it. Now, this whole thing about assessment, my problem across the country when I look at assessment, our assessments, we take assessments And someone thought it was a good idea to compare us to people overseas. So we take these assessments and we say, oh, we're doing worse than this and we're doing worse than that. The problem is that all the industrialized countries, of which our base assessments are based upon, have a 12-month education calendar. So we're being assessed in 9 months what they get a year to learn. We're always going to come up short. So I think there's a level of invalidation of, if we want to use it as a relative metric between schools of how they're doing, that's fine. But they can't be a metric of how we're doing as a school system. I think it's invalid. I think they're asking teachers to do something that they shouldn't have to do. There's that piece. The other piece that affects Prince Williams, and it's affected kids in my class, is because there's a certain amount that's a transitory nature in terms of kids going in and out of the school, which is supposed to be resolved by Common Core, but it doesn't. And then when people moving in and out of the area, et cetera, a teacher teaches the best when the learning level within the classroom is homogeneous. When everyone that's in that class is not too far ahead, not too far behind, but right where they need to be. Because when you put kids in a classroom where you have kids that don't quite qualify, kids that qualify, and kids in the middle, the teachers tend to teach to the lower half of the C student so they can bring along some of these other kids. I think that's an issue in Prince William, but I think it would need to be studied more to quantify it. I say this, that I've seen it in other places where we have quantified it and anecdotally dealing with, and it's only a couple dozen teachers talking with and observing and that kind of thing that's come back to say that these are structural issues within Prince William. In my opinion, I think that the state needs to have a standard that only includes something like 75% of what needs to be taught, and that 25% needs to be purely left up to the school district to create a supplemental standard of what is actually taking place in the classroom. I think that is the most responsive and flexible thing that you can do. When you have a standard that outpaces the number of days you're allowed to teach it, your results are going to be iffy. And I think a lot of the edges of the results that Prince William is having is due to the fact that you can't do better because the standard is not reasonable. My opinion, based on what I've looked at.
Thank you, Mr. Lott. I have some questions of myself. You mentioned that speaking multiple languages isn't that beneficial. I teach French, so I took that a little personally. But actually, I will speak on behalf of all the monolingual people that I've had to interpret for in systems of crisis that I think I was pretty essential in speaking 7 languages. I think, when you're talking about the graduation rates, you said that we're doing something pretty well and that no need to muddy a system that's already working. I recently saw some data, in the Education Committee, Commissioner Hadow had provided some data about graduation rates improvements, and that's actually across nationally. What we saw that was school districts did very quickly get an improvement in their graduation rates, but we didn't see that same improvement. You said that what we should be looking at, I think you said, was graduation rates versus math competency and literacy. So I did, being an educator and working on education stuff myself all the time, I'm very interested. And the gaps between black students and white students are pretty large there. In math literacy, in Prince William County, of course, which is what our task is. And so even though the graduation rate was, within the points that you had mentioned, and I wonder how much of that is because of the difference. You said that we turn our noses as educators towards things that aren't necessarily important, like standard diplomas versus advanced diplomas. Could you speak to the curriculum in an advanced diploma and how, because there's a big difference, more than 10 points on the students, black students getting advanced diplomas, and other races as well. Obviously, there's differences. Can you speak a little bit to how much of an impact you think the types of diploma students is getting is on their literacy based on the requirements of each of those diplomas, applied studies, advanced studies, and standard?
Yeah. So I'll start with the antidote. When I was a senior in high school, right, I had already been in college for 3 years. And I take one class at the high school in order to play football. Harvard came and they invited me to go and study there. And my mindset was I wanted to go to the University of Delaware. I wanted to be a history professor. It was settled. I was done. I was going to play football there. That's what it was going to be. And they convinced me, and I said, why did you show up here? They said, well, the SAT scores came out, and the way we do affirmative action is we don't assume we have to change the standard. We assume that there are qualified blacks out there who just never thought to do it. And the part that, the work that has to be done is Prince William needs to have a protocol to determine why based on data collection. Because I'm going to tell you, from a cultural standpoint, I was a great student. And there are so many things in my life I never would have even thought of. My income goal was to make $25,000 a year.
I'm sorry to cut you off. I just wanted to be specific on time since I
Okay,
want to
so I'll be
mention this.
specific. You
So
need to put
specific
together a
about,
protocol to determine that, because just like the unemployment rate, there is no blanket answer to that.
so there's no blanket answer, so we can't factor out race.
I'm saying, okay, you can factor out racial discrimination unless you find a reason to include it. It is more likely, just as I said from the beginning, that blacks and whites start from a different point. Doesn't mean the system from that point forward is racist. It means that it takes time to correct. Okay, so I'm saying in your situation, doesn't mean that that there are individuals of a race that have not been impacted in some way where they wouldn't think to do this or want to do it, or in their peer group not encouraged to do it, right? Those are data points that you have to do the work to find out.
Right, and I think data is absolutely important, as you're saying. The reason I'm asking is
Yep.
as an educator, of course, we look at these numbers, and you mentioned standards-based grading. We do actually do standards-based grading. We have to be very familiar with our standards because we have to list them in the grade book as though this is the specific standard that I was testing. This is the standard that we're speaking to. So Prince William County does a great job as far as adopting standards-based grading, which we recently did. The question that I asked again, and I'm asking this, is because me being an educator, I look at these things differently. Do you have an educational background? I know you said systems engineer in building the systems, but do you have a licensure?
I've developed education systems for the last 10 years.
I appreciate that, but do you have like,
I was-
instruction in curriculum development or in, you have
Yes.
you have an education background in,
I've taught at the graduate level. I've developed software for K-12. I've worked with all of the publishers to develop software for them to K-12 to understand the education life cycle. If you're going to tell me that my perspective is invalid because I'm not a teacher, I'm going to respond that the State Department asked me to do the study because the perspective of teachers resulted in failure, and that sometimes an outside perspective is valid, should be listened to, and blended in. Doesn't mean you have to take my word at it, but it doesn't mean that you look at me and try to disqualify what I am saying based upon the fact that we have different backgrounds. So I understand how education works. I consulted when Common Core was put together, and yes, the system that we developed seeks to align standard with whatever's taught. But I'm going to tell you from a human standpoint, it is an invalid exercise. And the reason why it's an invalid exercise is that it depends on perspective. And the reason why your assessment tests are faulty is because the people who write them are distanced from the people who are teaching it. And that creates a misalignment. I can take a given, if you want to tell me that there's a possibility that racial nuance can change the interpretation of a test, if you want me to accept that, then I'm going to tell you this, that there is nuance from teacher to teacher that changes what they're teaching on a given standard. And we have no way of saying, okay, when we look at an outcome in a classroom, right? And we have two different sets of teachers.
Sorry, just want to reclaim my time here
Okay, go for it.
and say that I just wanted to clarify the
Mr.
fact that I
Chairman,
wasn't
Mr.
attacking.
Chairman, what is the point of cutting him off? I mean, you
It's
did
my
do that to
question,
the
sir.
other-
Sir, it's my question.
But you just cut him off from answering your question because you don't like the answer.
Because it
You
wasn't
didn't
being
do it to
answered.
the
My
other
question
person.
specifically was about,
I
Commissioner
thought he
Hadow,
was
please.
answering it just fine.
What I wanted to say, sir, thank you for your answers and for being here and for being willing to answer them. I think that's credit to you, as you were, and I said during the Education Committee. I didn't mean to attack anyone's background. I think it's very necessary to have all types of perspectives. I was just saying that since my lens was that of an educator, obviously very clearly, I just wanted to ask on that. But I understand that you were passionate about thinking that I was excluding you because of that. But I do thank you for it. Those are my two questions, so I'll move on to,
Can I ask a question of you?
yes, but if we could do it later,
Okay.
if you could ask me a question later, thank you. Ms. Williams, I know that your light was on before
My light was on.
Commissioner Oh, I'm so sorry. You see, I missed those.
Wait sometime.
I'm so sorry. I was trying to look on both sides the entire time. Commissioner Steverson, your floor, and then we'll get back to it.
I like the way the last guy was treated. He was treated nice.
Thank you, Mr. Lott. You make a lot of sense. And if your data is accurate, then your presentation is very encouraging to me. I got from what you said that there's the role of parents in early reading are very important in determining a child's success, probably more so than just the public schools. My parents were both high school dropouts. But all three of their kids raised in a segregated environment have postgraduate college degrees. So I'm going to look at your website, I'm going to go over it, and I'm going to
Yep.
scour it, but your presentation is very encouraging to me. Thank you.
I just want to comment. So reading is the way is the methodology that we use to try to control an eventual result, okay? But it doesn't mean that your parents didn't give you a stimulating environment that achieves the same thing in absence. My mother has eighth grade education, but I'll tell you clearly, she's the smartest person in my family. And it was her parenting practice that gave me a richly and deeply stimulating environment. Unfortunately, depending on where you are in, rural blacks tend to suffer from the effect less than urban blacks, because in the process of life, it's more stimulating. When you get clusters in cities like Baltimore, et cetera, where it's overcrowded in smaller living facilities, it tends to have a significant impact. So I guess that's, as a background, we validated our learning data with Caldwell University in Canada in their neuroscience department. And our idea was to take whatever our analysis was and to compare it against biochemistry and neurology. And so, early childhood development and reading, et cetera, it was what they informed us. They said, well, this makes sense because the human brain develops from the front to the back. So the phonological loops, language, going forward to critical thinking. So that being the case, giving the idea of synaptic pruning, these educational activities would best support biological brain function.
Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Steverson. Now, what I was going to say is, Ms. Williams, you did have an opportunity to ask a question before. If we could allow Commissioner Allen to go.
I yield. She can go.
Okay.
She can go.
I'm fine. I didn't see it, that's my fault.
Okay. Mr. Lott, thank you very much. I appreciate your presentation. Certainly, I love seeing good numbers, and that helps me in my side. The only thing I'm looking at here is about the start of 1959,
Yep.
the census data, and data is data.
Yep.
But sometimes data leaves out some things. And as an African American in data, some of the things we look at is, yes, I agree with socioeconomic status. That definitely impacts. We can look at our own communities that, and that may not have to do with race necessarily.
Yep.
But in looking at the cultural response instruction, I'm looking at this and yours, and there's some good in all of it.
Yep.
And you mentioned you use Solomon. I like that. Nothing new under the sun. But it also, Solomon says, when we look at these things, there's a time for everything.
Yep.
Okay? And so I'm always looking for progression and progressiveness. but also for the African American community. And besides just poverty, there has been this spirit of brokenness because of what happened before 1959. And so when we look at some things in school, identity-wise, because I grew up in Washington, D.C.,
Yeah.
you mentioned my poor city up there in education, but it would have helped to have those role models to look like me, to inspire me. I made it. I did okay. But it certainly would have helped to have that, or to have that taught to me in school. And not to say nothing is wrong with all your data, but I think there's something that should be looked at in there as far as the mindset.
Tell you where I agree with you.
Yes, sir.
When I made the statement that we have to focus on truth and not necessarily on these other issues. So let's just look at what led to the Civil War, right? What we're taught, what is in the textbook is not true, okay? There's a further context to it that whites did not easily accept slavery, okay? But the science of the day created studies during the period of Enlightenment to assert that evolutionary-wise, blacks were designed to be subservient to whites, okay? With only a 1% to 5% presence of slaves in the country, most whites would never encounter a slave, meet a slave. So where did they get their viewpoint from? They got their viewpoint from the media of their day. So the vast majority of white society, for the benefit of the powerful, were taught that we were this way. And it was 3 slave rebellions that started to change the writing in the press. And you can look at this in Boston and in northern newspapers, where the slave rebellions made people question what they thought was settled science about what the black person was. And then the Nat Turner, that broke it. Once that came out, whites started not to accept that blacks were destined to be slaves. But Lincoln and the government also had not seen blacks living at an equal level within the American society. So even though there were those founders and there were those early people that were against slavery, they had never encountered a black person that could stand with them intellectually. It was Frederick Douglass's visits to Abraham Lincoln that sealed the deal, where he saw Frederick Douglass' intellectual capability as proof that blacks could one day live in an American society on par with whites. That is not in the history books, and it should be. So I'm not defending the way it is now, what is in there. I think that the history books need to be rethought, but I don't think that the history books should be rethought in a way that demonizes one side or the other. It was a grand experiment with lots of messiness to it and lots of misunderstanding by men of those days. But we have worked through that system to make things better than it was before. That's all I'm saying. I understand racism. I've lived in it. But I also, like you, I can tell you what my experience is in 1972 is not what it was in 1984, not what it is in 1998, and not what it is today. And I could see, and just as passing civil rights legislation didn't just end things, it took time for things to flush out. And I'll bet you have friends who were racist or spouted racist dialogue back in the day, and they'll come forward today and say, that's just how we were told it was supposed to be. It wasn't a deep felt hate of you. It was just what was out there and what people accepted. And that means that we can teach in a way that furthers that progress, as opposed to standing back and trying to use a racist past as the foundation of our future and our ideologies. That's what I object to.
Okay. I just didn't hear that in that culturally responsive instruction, but I thank you for your explanation.
I think culturally responsive instruction, if framed in a certain way, in the way that we've been talking about, is a positive thing. I think that there are forces that want to take culturally responsive learning and use it for something that most of us would never want it to be used for. That's what I think. And I think that we can't ignore that. When we talk about crossovers between tenets of CRT and cultural responsiveness, there should be no crossover. We should rethink this on its own as a new thing to plot a path forward for our children and this country. That is just my feeling on it. That's my opinion of it.
Thank you. School Board Member Williams, then Commissioner, okay. Commissioner, no, her light was off. That's why I thought, were you,
I just wanted to say thank you.
oh,
Thank you.
do you want to go? Okay. Yes,
Okay,
School Board Member Williams.
Thank you, Vice Chair Akbar. So I don't say that I'm confused because I disagree. There are definitely things that I do not see eye to eye with you on in your presentation, and that's understandable because we don't all agree about everything. But that's not where my confusion comes from. It's more how you link your data points in your presentation and your anecdotes into my ability to understand what it is that you're trying to say to benefit us as the commission and what you think that the commission should take away from your presentation tonight and your statements tonight that would bring us value that maybe we could use in our report. That's where my confusion comes in. And I'll give you an example. A lot of your presentation and anecdotes focus on the poverty rate and how that correlates to or corresponds to lower academic performance. You're saying like there are not as good schools or issues with students living in poverty that tends to lead to lower outcomes, if I'm understanding what you're saying correctly.
Not sequentially, but more of a circular relationship.
Okay, because maybe you can help me understand this then. So in Prince William County, our free reduced lunch rate has gone up over the past several years.
Yep.
Right? But our graduation rate has also gone up.
Yep.
So when you talk about poverty rate and outcomes and performance, I'm wondering what your take is on that when we have technically more poorer students, but still higher graduation rates amongst our ethnicities.
So first thing is poverty rate for free lunches has been redefined several times. It's going to go up. It's actually designed to not necessarily to eliminate poverty, but to have a means-based test, but at the same time provide a meal to as many children as possible in the system. So they don't just go whatever the poverty rate is. The qualification is X times whatever the poverty rate is if you're below this percentile. So it doesn't mean that everyone that's getting free lunch is poor. It just means that they're within whatever the metric that the government puts out, and it changes over time. In this particular system, where we are now with the pandemic, et cetera, the calculus that ends up pushing out what that is has changed. I mean, they give my kids free lunch, and I'm nowhere near poor.
Well, everyone gets free lunch this year, so
Well,
let's take out this year.
So there's that situation. I think that your confusion is caused by the fact of your disagreement, and so therefore you are applying granularity rather than trying to first understand the 30,000-foot level. Because as in all things, there are exceptions. We can have the macro system that works a particular way, but that there are going to be exceptions to certain rules and situations. And there's data. You're asking me a question that there's no data behind. For example, those students that are becoming more poor, are they moving into the district? Or are they born here? Are they children of graduates of the Prince William County school system? Or are they graduates, or their parents graduate someplace else that was less of a school system? There's so many data points to make it impossible for me to explain what you're asking me.
But you had no problem doing that.
Because
presentation.
Because is the poverty rate fallen 3 times greater for blacks than whites over the last 60 years?
No, I was talking about the poverty of our students my question was, our poverty rate has gone up amongst our students. We have more Title I schools. We are a majority, minority, even though I hate that terminology, for Prince William County.
Yep.
So that would include minority students, African Americans, Hispanics, and so forth. The
Yep.
poverty rate of these children have gone up, but the graduation rate has also gone up. So I was wondering how, during your
I would-
presentation, you talked
I
about
would need to look at the data points for
specifically.
that.
Okay.
I didn't.
Well, no, not just Prince William County, but you made a correlation to poverty being indicative of lower
Because the
performing
correlation is
students. Okay,
Be-
well,
Because Success Academy,
Vice Chair.
they're all poor. Success Academy outperforms academically all of the schools in New York State, okay? They outperform them because of the rigor of their system. They are still poor. They did not become unpoor. But there were actions taken to mitigate the effects of poverty. So if Prince William County is doing things to mitigate the effects of poverty, that is something to applaud. It doesn't invalidate what I'm saying. It simply says that if we look at the data in Prince Williams County, we may need to have a protocol to understand it better so that we can further increase that. I never said that there's I never said what you said. There are trend lines, and we have to look at trend lines. And then I also said, like the unemployment rate is meaningless nationally, we have to look at local and put in place protocols to measure it. So as I stated before, what would I say? I would say Prince William County needs to put in protocols to measure some very specific granular pieces so that you can come forward with recommendations for better outcomes. Understand why you're successful, where you're successful, and how you can improve that. In my opinion, to simply talk about social and racial justice, not in a vacuum, but in the ether of the undefined world, how can you make a recommendation for something you have not defined? And so my recommendation is it's too early because you haven't defined it.
okay.
You don't know what it means yet.
Okay.
Because these assumed racial undertones are false.
Oh, well, thank you for
Thank you.
that answer. And then my second question is, so
Vice
Mr.
Chair.
William, if we could-
Vice Chair.
I thought we had two questions.
Yes, we do have two questions. That's, I just wanted to clarify. We have two questions per person.
I'm sorry. I'm going to need a lot of
You'll-
clarification
You
because
can ask, do you
it's
let her
been
finish her
3
second
questions
question?
in the past, and no one has been able to come back with another question.
It's-
I've been shut down. Hadal's
Then
been
we
shut
have,
down.
we've had two questions. Thank you.
Commissioner Haddo actually had a round two. I'm going through my
It's
round two.
happened
so-
every time, so.
But if you
Commissioner
don't
Haddo
mind,
did
let
have a
me
round
two
finish
with
my
Mr. Lott.
question.
I did.
That'd
You
be
were the
great.
first person, just to clarify, you were the first person to address Mr. Lott, and then you did address before. When I said, I made a little face motion because I'd forgotten that you had gone before I asked anyone else if they wanted to go for the first time. So you did have twice.
I just have-
School Board Member Williams, if
Sure.
you could, but if we could do it quickly in
Sure.
response to any
So,
question, that'd be beneficial.
You know, Prince William County has a long history of collaborating with outstanding presidential award-winning programs like EIP, which works specifically with minority students who are first in their families to go to college. They teach not only booster the skills in prep in the summertime for students for the classes that they're going to take in the fall, but a large component of that program is dealt with culturally responsive teaching students about their history, about their culture, how that impacts them, how that impacts their learning. And because of that, these students graduate, often go on to college. They have a successful track history and program. Prince William County Schools also has incorporated culturally responsive teaching for the last 20 years. And so I'm wondering, how is it that you, I know you said you do agree with some aspects of culturally responsive
respond now, 'cause I
teaching,
think I understand your
but I'm wondering, how is it that you account for programs like that have such a high success factor that they're, you know, presidentially awarded programs, they're over 20 years old,
Yep.
and they do benefit specifically
Yep.
African-American Hispanic students. And then I'm also a graduate of that, so I can attest to the impact that had and my desire to continue my education, because I was going to drop out of high school. I didn't feel the need
Yep.
to continue learning because I wasn't learning anything relevant to who I was as an individual.
Williams, if we could wrap up the question,
So how do
please.
you account for successes of those programs where the focus is academic rigor in addition to cultural responsive and relevant teaching?
There's no data, and I've looked all over to try to find it. There's no data where socially aware teaching, whatever you want to call it, had a positive effect in the absence of rigor. But I do have evidence, documented evidence, where rigor has created success in the absence of all of the social and racial justice, which means that the reason why, two things happen, right? It succeeds because of the rigor. You take the other stuff out, still going to succeed, doesn't really matter. You may have felt better going through it, but the thing was the rigor. That's the first thing. The second thing is most programs that people stick to are self-selected, okay? It's just like a private school. Private school kids are not smarter than public school kids. Private school kids are just self-selected because they self-select the involvement of parents, right? Same thing with a charter school. There's nothing magic about a charter school, right? Except when parents, it's selecting parents who focus on education, and you're taking the bunch of the kids, you're putting together. I came back for Christmas during my freshman year and said, oh, my professors are so smart. My 8th grade education, mom said, I said, well, here it comes. What's she talking about? She goes, well, if you take a bunch of smart kids and throw them in a room, you just give them a book, they probably learn the same thing. And she made a point. It was easier to be a professor at Harvard than to be a teacher in an inner city school. It's just a lot easier. And so your result is anecdotal. The programs that are getting these rewards, all of the fluff around them, none of them without rigor succeed. None of them. Therefore, it is the rigor, because you have Jewish programs that don't talk about it. You have other programs. You have various Catholic programs that are a certain way. You have Baptist programs that are a certain way. You have all of the fluff around rigor. The common denominator is rigor. That's my answer.
Thank you, Commissioner Tredinnick.
Thank you again for being here. This is the first speaker that has come that is not aligning with the agenda of the majority on this board. And I would like to just point out and speak to the fact that the rules have continued to change for each speaker that we speak to. And the way Mr. Hadow addresses a speaker is frowned upon, and then the same interaction occurs again. And it's frustrating to me to watch it occur, because there's a way to ask a question in a way that you don't agree without being condescending or rude. And I'm frustrated because the rules continue to change, and we're sitting here again for a long period of time with a long agenda. And again, you all want to ask what we're doing here and how it pertains to our commission. I'd like to ask the same question as to why our agenda doesn't suit that, and why we're still inviting speakers at this late in the game when we asked for him to come months ago. So I'm having trouble sitting here and watching the contradiction occur. And that's all I'd like to say. Thank you again, Mr. Lott.
Thank you. Just since you mentioned a procedural motion, thank you so much, Mr. Lott, obviously, for being here. Appreciate you being here to present in front of us. Just a note on it, it's not my intention to change rules. I'm following the same rules that were established before. And Mr. Lott did present in front of the Education Committee, which then was, Chair Rock decided to add him to the agenda of this. So we're happy. Thank you twice now for being in front of us.
And just to be open, individual conversations, you have my number.
Sure.
Open dialogue. That's all I'm asking. If you want to understand me, it may take a couple of times over coffee to do that, or me understanding you, because I need to acquire new knowledge and adjust my perspective where that is, where that needs to be. And I've learned a lot here today from the other speakers and each of you, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you all.
Thank you. Appreciate you being here. Moving on to the next